Hi, my name is Camryn, and this is my presentation on forensic linguistics, specifically looking at death row statements and suicide notes. Just as a fair warning, there will be discussion of death, murder, and suicide within the presentation. So what exactly is forensic linguistics? It's the scientific study and analysis of language as it pertains to law and actually breaking the law with crime. And that it can include written law and documents, or it can include speech and things that were said during court cases or crime. It was first coined by Jan Spartak in 1968 when he published a paper as a linguistics professor. As well, FL, as it's abbreviated in the field, has different degrees of reliability as evidence and a source for information. And there are many different areas that forensic linguistics can be applied. And these are just a multitude of different documents and types of documents that could be included in the types. But specifically, this presentation is looking at suicide letters or notes and death row statements. But what exactly are death row statements? Inmates typically get a chance to express their final sentiments or last words before they're executed to the people present. That includes witnesses or individuals who are actually executing the inmate. And it's a specifically interesting topic to think about and learn about as it has gone on. But human beings are able to comprehend their mortality, which makes EMT, or management theory, as it was theorized by Becker in 1973, much more interesting in the context of death row statements, because an otherwise healthy individual is being forced to reckon with and come to terms with their own death at the hand of other people, which they've been sentenced to. And so a lot of the death row statements typically have defense mechanisms within the prisoner's last words to promote their identity or self-esteem. And usually the format is kind of short and final, but they're typically an oration of feelings about incarceration or how they are feeling at the time of the execution. And so two studies that I found particularly interesting were about time perception, which looked at an inmate's education and its correlation with the amount of words that were actually said during the statement. And as the education goes up, the number of words also went down. It also shows that the number of sentences an inmate received also seemed to correlate with the words. And again, as the words went down, the number of sentences also seemed to go down. So the less time that they were sentenced, the less words, the less things they had to actually say. As well, age plays into the construction of tenses being used in the statements. So younger inmates typically used simple present tense, which is I am, you are, talking about things as they are in the moment. While 60 to 70-year-olds in the highest concentration of tenses, about 31% of their speech was used with present perfect tense, which is I have been, you have been, talking more in the past. And as well, because of TMT and trying to avoid feelings of terror about death, speech can speed up and there can be panic that can be extrapolated from the statements in an attempt to lengthen their life or just, again, coming to terms with their own mortality. And so that other study that I found was dealing with self-preservation and meaning. So patterns within the meaning in order of prominence is the long list in about the middle section of the slide, but most of the things that were said by inmates were typically very positive or trying to seek forgiveness and taking responsibility for their actions, usually expressing some kind of love or appreciation for people in their lives, for the times that they had been given on the earth. And also with that, prayers and mentioning different religious figures were very common. The actual negative connotation that death row statements and criminals' last words is very few. There were about 5% in concentration of discussion about the crime itself or threats and accusations. So that is kind of a stereotype that was challenged within the study. But the structure of the last row statements typically, or death row statements, I apologize, typically tends to run along the same pattern with some kind of reference to the self at the beginning, talking about, I am sorry, like I am feeling sad, things along those lines. While personal ties are then shown, so talking about their family, their loved ones, friends, things such to construct a positive self-image and kind of lessen their own guilt or regret in some way. And then defining the situation, so how they ended up in death row or incarcerated, can also be very influential in the death row statements. And usually responsibility or guilt and the victim is inserted into this section, about the third section. And finally, dealing with the situation, actually coming to terms with what is happening, comes around the end. And so this was supposed to be a little case study, but also interactive part of the presentation. So this is from Virginia Woolf's 2 different suicide notes, one to her sister and one to her husband. And throughout the excerpts, you can see clear denotations where she's talking about, I'm hearing voices, I can't concentrate, I feel like this will never pass. There's a lot of hopelessness, a lot of despair that's being shown. There's also cognitive processes, so talking about I've gone too far, like you will never come back from a certain spiral of thoughts and things as such. But generally, there are some patterns within suicide notes, and suicide notes are often left behind by one who commits suicide. While forgery is common, if authorship is proven, suicide can then be determined, and other theories of why a person died can be dismissed. So Durkheim actually classified suicides into 4 different categories in 1992, starting with egoistic, which is typically a lonely or hopeless kind of death. And then altruistic, so thinking that the needs of the group are more important than their own, very sacrifice-like in nature. Anomic is when social regulation is too low, thinking about like the stock market crash of the 1920s and how people believed that the world would never return back to it the way that it was. So they ended their life. And then finally, fatalistic, which is excessive oppression or despair. And how I came to understand this category was that it was often outside perspectives that weighed in on the suicide, not necessarily like an egoistic where there's more brain chemistry and feelings of despair within just the person, not outside of them. So there are some common features and words that can be found throughout the corpus or collection of suicide notes. I and social words are very common. Emotions, talking about love, anger, sadness, and cognitive processes, either ones that they weren't able to grapple with, or the ones that they feel are the most important to talk about why they can no longer go on living. As well, lexical categories can be analyzed to find out or imply the author's headspace at the time of writing the note. And so there are some key differences, such as how TMT, or terror management theory, comes into play with each of these documents. So when a suicide note is written, typically the person writing it knows the exact manner, knows the exact time, and is already at peace with dying and killing themselves, while a person on death row can't avoid it, while a person on suicide who is taking their own life can avoid it much easier than the person on death row. So that plays into what is actually being said. As well, family and loved ones can help with the construction of each of them. Suicide notes are typically talking about saying you're sorry and saying that none of it was the person who's reading it's fault. While a death row statement is also saying this, but individuals who are surrounding the inmate who's being executed can actually affect what is being said, versus if they were going to write a note to their family by themselves. And so the future of forensic linguistics is kind of up in the air, but as technology progresses, it's most likely that FL will have to as well. So machine learning can be really helpful in a lot of ways, talking about suicide notes and compiling a multitude of different sources and looking through orthographic analysis, so handwriting, and making sure that there is no way that there is a forgery as evidence of suicide. But as well, social media is expanding at a rapid rate, much like a lot of things, but there's more likelihood of concentrations in FL to begin to show up in higher frequencies in police stations because of social media's prevalence and evolution. So corpus analysis can be especially important to both of these different documents. So it's typically most helpful with suicide notes. And there are even theories that a larger collection, which corpus actually means its collection or body, that there will be less bias in FL investigation if there is more of either document. But as well, there could be new legislation and moving towards less institutional racism, breaking down the prison complex in the United States. Death row statements could begin to diminish. So this could also affect how death row statements are interpreted. And finally, I have my citations and just some resources if any of this triggered anything. Not my intention, but always make sure to look out for yourself. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.